Happy New Year, and welcome back to Building Process. Today, we are talking about processes that break. We're talking about broken processes and the systems and tools that we use to run our businesses that we eventually outgrow, maybe because they had flaws to begin with, maybe because there's more people using them, maybe because the tools have changed, maybe because we've changed, our perspective has changed. Whatever the case, you will have systems and processes in your business that will break down, and you will need to find ways to evaluate them and get them to a new stage. This is something that happened to me in the last quarter, and it was something I was thinking more about coming into the new year. So I thought it'd be great to kick off the year with a show like this, in part because a lot of us are taking stock of what happened in 2025 and looking forward to 2026. Maybe we have growth plans, maybe we have downsize plans. It's possible we have steady plans. Whatever the plans, there's new ways for us to engage with our business. There are always things we can improve. And this is a way to look at the things that may be breaking down over time. So, what I wanted to do first was go over what I found to be a useful evaluation framework here. And you can see it if you're looking at the screencast on the screen, which is to start by evaluating the risk level of the process. And I'll give an example here. A risky process break is one where key information is being exposed, or potentially you are creating legal or financial exposure well in excess of the actual process itself. So one example I could recommend from the HR domain is I-9 verification, which is something that has to happen on the first day of employment with new employees based in the US. If for some reason you found out that I-9 verification was not happening correctly in your business, that would be a critical risk because you are in fact violating employment law when you don't do that within the proper parameters of the verification. So that would be a critical risk. But then there's other processes. For instance, maybe you have a process for trading in old devices that's a little inefficient and isn't exactly working according to spec, and occasionally has devices sit around longer than they should for resale. That is probably not a critical risk unless there's some kind of data wiping process that's involved, in which case that's something you can take a little bit more time on. So when you have a critical risk level, it's important to take over. And what I mean by that is you need to immediately intervene. So in that situation that I brought up earlier, another thing that comes up a lot in the critical risk is something like cybersecurity, financial security. You do not wait for the new process to exist. You just need to go in and do the manual version of that process. So that is the take over step. And then taking critical action is whatever you need to do to get that back on track. In the I-9 example I had, you need to get that happening within 24 hours. Whatever it needs to happen is what needs to happen. After that, you will need to figure out if this lapse has been caused because of some kind of miscommunication or misunderstanding of the process, or if there's actually an ethical concern. If there is some kind of ethical concern where somebody is maliciously doing something, or someone's committing fraud, or totally unaware or totally underqualified for the role that they're in, then you'll also need to take action in terms of those people. Make sure that they're in the right place, that they're doing things they should be doing. Obviously, in the realm of any full-on ethical violation, you'd be looking at terminating someone's employment or terminating a vendor dependent who did it. So that's a key part of the critical action you'll have to take. From there, you will step into the normal process that you also have for non-critical broken processes, and that's to solicit feedback and then to create a new proposal and then to pilot that for 2 to 4 weeks. One of the key things that I want to emphasize is it's very important to sit back. And I have a tendency to act very quickly. And so one of the things I learned in this experience of several processes breaking down is I could very quickly replace something and then have people equally unsatisfied on the other end of that. And that's probably the biggest lesson that I want to put forward in this show, is that when you take time to solicit the feedback, to create the proposal, and then to pilot the program, what you're doing is creating buy-in for the new process. And this is particularly important when you've had either some kind of breach of trust, so some kind of thing, let's take that I-9 verification example, is not going well. That's a situation where you are potentially legally culpable for that. So you want to make sure that you can rebuild the trust. But even in non-critical processes, you want to take the feedback seriously and recognize that, hey, this isn't working for me. This way of trading in my laptop, for instance, when I was finished with it and got a new laptop was not convenient. It was not easy. That created some hassle, some struggle for me. Now, maybe it's less of a credibility thing, but what you want to do is be receptive to that feedback and not just say, oh, you'll deal with it and it'll be another 3 years before we have that problem. You really want to go and show them that you are doing something to improve the process. Not only because we in this environment care about building good processes, but you're also trying to make sure that people recognize that you're someone who takes action and someone who does take their feedback seriously. So the process of soliciting feedback, creating the new proposal, and then piloting it will create the structure for you to gain the trust of the other people in your team. So these are the two paths I wanted to show in terms of the things that actually happened. And now I want to look at some cases. What I have is some historical examples of processes that broke down. And some of these you'll know of and others may be new to you, but these are more like business cases and talking about what the companies did. And then we'll go through some samples and talk about some of the approaches we could use to fix those processes. So let's take a look. We've got something over in Claude right here. All right. So we have Toyota's accelerator pedal recall. This was in 2009 and 2010. So the breakdown from Claude here is Toyota's quality control process failed to catch a design flaw where the floor mats could trap accelerator pedals, and the separate issue was sticky pedals. The company's famous Toyota production system had gaps in how it escalated and responded to field complaints. Now, this is a great one to bring up because Toyota is a company lauded for their high quality of process. So the fact that they had some kind of high profile failure is important, and it should help you to recognize that no one is immune from this. And that means you will constantly have to work with these situations. The possibility of skipping failure altogether, that's not going to happen. You're going to have processes that break down. So it's important to know how to deal with them. What Toyota did was overhauled its customer feedback loops. They created a dedicated swift market analysis response team that could halt production faster. They also decentralized some quality decision making to regional teams rather than routing everything through Japan. What I love about that solution is it has so many different elements to it where they were evaluating each of the specific failure points and creating new structures to manage those failure points. So this is another one I remember from a little over a decade ago, but that was the Knight Capital's trading algorithm disaster, and that was a software deployment, so near and dear to my heart coming from the software world. The software deployment process failure caused Knight Capital to lose $440 million in 45 minutes. Old test code was accidentally activated on production servers because their deployment checklist didn't verify that deprecated code had been removed from all 8 servers. That is a bad day, especially if you were on the QA team. And the fix was the industry broadly adopted more rigorous deployment verification processes, including automated deployment systems that treat infrastructure as code, mandatory rollback procedures, and kill switches that could halt trading algorithms automatically based on loss thresholds. Those kill switches are really great. That's a really cool reactive measure, but one of the things that has changed a lot in the industry since 2012 is how we treat deployment and servers, and we often fire up servers just for single-use purposes. So this idea of legacy code being available on the server is less of a problem these days. So I'm going to pick out another one from the list of 10 here. We'll look at something a little bit more recent, which was the British Airways IT outage. So a contractor accidentally disconnected a power supply at a data center. The real process failure was that the disaster recovery procedures assumed gradual failover, not sudden power loss. When systems came back online, the surge corrupted data and cascaded failures across multiple systems. So the breakdown here was that they assumed a power failure would happen in a certain way, and then when it happened in a different way, they had no resilience for that. So the fix was British Airways invested in redesigning their disaster recovery process to include hard restart scenarios, implemented better power redundancy with automatic failovers that did not require human intervention, and separated critical booking systems so they could operate independently. One of the key things to note here is that you should assume all possibilities are on the table. And what happens in many automated systems is people will test what we call the happy path, and they will not think about some of the worst cases, like the sudden power failover situation. So that's a good example of what happened here. So there are 10 examples in the list from Claude. I'm going to include those all in the show document, but you can start to see what is going on here. Unexpected things happened, something that was not on anyone's agenda for the year. The process broke down, and then a fix was deployed that often, at least in every case we mentioned here, included multiple different steps, multiple different procedures for defense or reaction, to these potential failures. So that's often the path that you're going to have to go. Where you have a process that is failing now, you may have to implement 2 to 5 new things on the other end to make sure that that is working correctly. And you may have to just replace it wholesale, but even whatever you replace it with, assuming you're growing and the tools are getting more complex as they are, you're going to have to do that in a more robust way in the future. And you always want to think of your processes from a perspective of scale, because the vast majority of businesses and organizations, if not growing, at least want to get more sophisticated at what they're doing and be able to move faster, move with greater efficiency, and use the best tools available to them. So let's take a look at some scenarios here that we can run through. So we'll do 3 of these. We'll start with number 1 here, the vanishing customer complaint. A B2B software company notices that customer churn has increased 40% over 6 months. That is huge, by the way. When they investigate, they discover that customer support tickets marked resolved were often just closed without actual resolution. Support reps were measured on ticket closure time, not customer satisfaction. Complaints that required engineering involvement would sit in a shared Slack channel where no one had explicit ownership. So one of the first things I would look at here is, just because the team was incentivized, that is still a fundamentally dishonest thing they're doing by resolving tickets that are not actually resolved. So the incentive often points them in a direction that may not be helpful, but the fact that they were just marking them resolved, this shows a deeper level of issue with the team on just a purely ethical and honesty level. So I would have a long, hard look at the managers of these teams, and not only what are they incentivizing, but have they just been completely slacking? And it's very likely that you would have to do some organizational changes in a situation like this. If nothing else, you'd want to change the incentive to make it so that marking tickets resolved isn't actually what you get bonused on or incentivized on in the support team, but instead it's actually customer satisfaction. So this points to both the incentive problem, but also just a general problem with ethics and honesty within that team. Regardless, this seems like a critical issue to me, in the sense of 40% increase in churn is huge. That's going to have just a massive effect on a B2B software company, I can assure you of that. And so that kind of increase means all hands on deck. We got to solve the support problem, and there'd probably be some marketing and customer-centric communication to go with that, just to let everyone know that you're aware of the problem and you are actively working it. So that's a big one. Let's take another random one here. Number 4, the meeting that ate the decision. A product team has weekly prioritization meeting that's supposed to decide what gets built next quarter, but nothing ever gets decided. Discussions spiral, the loudest voices dominate, and the meeting ends with, let's take this offline. 3 months later, engineering is working on features no one explicitly approved because someone had to make a decision. Okay, so this is a super common problem in corporate America. Oftentimes what happens is there's not expectations about what is supposed to come out of a meeting and what kind of timeline for a decision has to happen. So this one cannot really be resolved without an intervention from leadership, but someone has to make a strong stance to say, by this point, we are deciding what we're building. And if you're not going to use the meeting to actually create those action items, then what you're going to get is the decision by executive, right? So you're offering the team and the employees the chance to weigh in their feedback, but if they're not able to get to decisions, if they're not able to get to action items by a certain point, and that certain point should be before they start working on these features, then the decisions will be made by the executive. And that aligns the incentives that you will get a decision no matter what, and you hope your decision-making power is good, but you also want to make sure the team has the incentive, has the opportunity to, hey, while we're meeting before we get to our product roadmap, let's figure out what we actually want to do. The other thing I would recommend is general rules for meetings. Like, there has to be a note taker, there has to be action items listed out and assigned at the end of the meeting, and then they have to be evaluated in the next meeting. And that's more of a general meeting hygiene thing, where you can use that regardless of the meeting you have, but that kind of behavior will steamroll into, it'll cascade into the actual decision making that you want to happen on the timeline, as opposed to just kicking it right up to leadership. And there may even be points or times when they actually do want to kick that decision over to leadership, but they shouldn't have to wait till the deadline to do that. They should start developing some agreement around that before they get to that point. Okay, let's take a look at one last situation here. So we have the documentation graveyard. A tech company has extensive process documentation in Confluence. It's completely out of date. The official process for deploying code hasn't matched reality for 18 months. New hires follow the documented process, break things, and then get told, oh, we don't do that way anymore, but no one updates the docs because there's no owner and no time allocated for it. As simple of a problem as this seems, this happens all the time. I've seen this happen on software development teams. And the solution here is to allocate time to this, is to make sure that the team knows that it's a priority. And a big reason it's a priority is if onboarding is not actually going to have accurate documentation, then that's going to take even longer. And so what you're doing is you're robbing the team of the ability to stay heads down on the features because they're constantly trying to help new people with onboarding because the documentation isn't correct. So doing the one-time fix of actually fixing the documentation, making sure it's up to date, is going to be something that actually gives you back time in the long run, because those new hires, the people you're onboarding, won't need so much hand-holding and so much customization in the process. The other thing I recommend for any kind of documentation like this is that there's a mandatory reevaluation schedule, probably something like once a quarter. That would make a lot of sense to just say, are we up to date here? And then what you do is you allocate a certain amount of, however you do it, points or t-shirt size in your sprint so that the team can update the documentation each quarter. You assume that update needs to happen. If it doesn't need to happen, great. The team has a bonus, but you always allocate the points in advance just to know that they have that time every quarter to update it. And the best teams will keep the documentation updated all the time. They'll go in and make little tweaks as they're doing things and as processes are changing. They may even have some kind of version control process for it, like using GitHub or some other kind of code management platform to manage the changes to documentation. And that's really the best way, because then you get the feedback, you have the long-term documentation and the auditability of that documentation. But if nothing else, you definitely need to have time allocated for it and some kind of regular review process. I suggest quarterly, but you can do more or less depending on how much things tend to change with your team. Okay, I'm going to include the rest of these scenarios that Claude brought up in our original document, but just wanted to go back to what we went over in this episode, that when a process breaks down, this is natural, this is normal, this is not an indictment of your ability to create processes. However, I would say if every single one of your processes is always breaking down, then you may want to look at some of your first principles, but they will break, they are going to. That is part of the function of your organization growing and pushing itself forward. Is it's going to get to the limits of the processes you have built. And your evaluation period should be longer than a moment so that you can actually get the buy-in for whatever the next solution is going to be. So take action quickly when it's critical, but when it's non-critical, go through the steps to spend some time to get that buy-in, to get people to believe in the new process and ideally help you with it as well. One of the things you'll find is the most rewarding about this is as you bring people into that process of creating the new process, you will get actually better results, because there'll be some new insights, some new ideas, and some new creativity coming from people who are not yourself. So definitely invite them in, if not just for feedback, but to actually help you build the next stage in your process. Thanks for listening to the show. Please tell people about it, especially those who are trying to better operate their business or organization. We are focused on evergreen content here. That means the timeless content that will not change with the AI platform of the week, but will instead be the kind of decisions you have to make to run a business or organization this day and age and going forward. You can check out the show at buildingprocess.substack.com or youtube.com/@buildingprocess. That's the channel where you'll get the video versions of the episode, and the Substack has all the posts. Thanks for listening, and thanks for helping us get off to a great 2026.